If you could swap lives with any character you created, what would it be?
As he sort of talks like this, I can smell a rat, you know. I was joking, it's the worst.
How do I make my kids read more?
And you know, now everyone's like this.
Yeah.
This little girl who was like that tall and about 10, she went, she's a two-faced It is hilarious.
What is tougher, comedy, writing, or being a dad?
Well, that's a good one.
Today on the Kidsstoppress Podcast, we're very excited to have somebody who has sold more than 50 million copies and counting in more than 53 languages and continues to inspire and enthrall children today. We welcome David Walliams to the Kidsstoppress Podcast. Good evening. Are you nervous?
No, I'm not too nervous, but you're a nice interviewer, aren't you?
Yes, I am, but I'm not as witty as you are, so I'm the one who's actually nervous.
Well, don't worry, I'm not going to say anything awful.
Okay.
Make you feel bad.
More importantly, we all know you as this incredibly popular and famous author, but I'm sure there's a lot that has gone into the making of this author. So tell me all about David as a child. What did he like? What did he dislike? And what really led you to be who you are today?
Well, I grew up in suburban England, outside of London. I wasn't a very sporty kid, so when all the other kids were out playing football on a Saturday afternoon, I was in my bedroom reading books or listening to comedy records, and you know, as a kid, even when you're just playing with toys, you're creating stories, aren't you, with them?
Yeah.
And so I was a kid who could get lost in his imagination for, you know, a long time, and I had quite an active imagination. Like I'd always think that my bedroom was like a kind of spaceship that could detach from the house, and it could take me off on lots of adventures at night. And so when I would pull back the curtains, you know, I'd be on the moon, or at a time when dinosaurs ruled the earth and things like that. So obviously I had a pretty active imagination, and so I suppose that put me in pretty good stead for writing my own stories one day and becoming a comedian and all that sort of thing. But I was quite introverted until 11 years old, I was in a play at school and I got my first kind of laughs. I didn't really know it'd be funny, but I was playing this queen. You know, I went to an all-boys school and none of the boys wanted to play the girls' parts apart from me. And so I got some laughs there and I thought, oh, this is good. I want to do this again. So two things were happening at once, I think. It was kind of a bit introverted and imaginative, but at the same time I wanted to get back on stage, be sort of extrovert David, and make people laugh.
So did you use your imagination in writing as an escape tool because you are introverted?
I mean, I suppose it is an escape, but
it's your comfort zone, because I see a lot of children who read a lot. They find comfort in those pages versus human conversations.
Well, I think that's definitely true. I mean, even as, you know, an adult writing these books, it's a great escape. Not that sort of ordinary life is so bad or anything, but it's just exciting to be in an imaginary world.
Right.
And if you're reading a book by an incredible storyteller like Roald Dahl, and he's taking you on this surreal journey like he does in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, it's an amazing place to be, isn't it? And of course, there's words on the page, there's a few illustrations, but most of the images are painted in your brain.
Right.
And so it's, I mean, the thing is, when you watch a film, and I loved watching movies and things, but it's very passive.
Yeah.
You know, you're sat there watching a movie, you don't have to do anything, do you? Other than just watch and listen. Everything's done for you in a movie, isn't it? There's music to tell you what to feel and stuff, but books are different. You're working along. It's half the author and half the reader, because if the reader doesn't paint pictures in their head, then, you know, they're not going to enjoy the book. So that's what you have to do. It's not just words on a page, is it? You work along with it.
Yeah.
And children's books are often the most imaginative. If you think about Harry Potter books or the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe or Alice in Wonderland, surreal things happen in children's books that don't happen that often in books for adults.
Right.
So I love the world of children's books.
I mean, it's so beautifully said where the reader and the author meets halfway to create that beautiful world. I love that. The other part of it, which you mentioned, where you had to play this queen, was that somewhere the reason why you're doing this insanely mad comedy that you do on your Instagram page and otherwise? What, you think the seeds were sown back then?
Yes, I think definitely. I mean, I think the thing is that when you make people laugh, it's just such a buzz. It was such a thrill. And I know it's sort of a bit of a cliche to say it was like a drug. I'm not sure it's the same as heroin, but it's sort of, this is for kids, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, let me not say that.
It's for the parents.
Oh, okay. Well,
so you can say it.
Okay, all right. What I'll say is that it was a real buzz appearing on stage, and such a buzz that's a bit addictive. And so as soon as I'd got onto the stage and made people laugh, I couldn't wait till the next opportunity. So every reading competition, every school play, every poetry recital, every public speaking competition, I was there, you know, first in the queue to have another go. And so, you know, I just sort of, I guess you hone that over time, don't you? I mean, it's like anything. You don't win Wimbledon on your first tennis match, do you?
Yeah.
You have to work at it for ages. And so I guess I was just studying people that I loved, like Rowan Atkinson, you know, played Mr. Bean, and Monty Python, and things like 40 Towers. I don't know if you know that show, but loads. There was always been loads of great British comedy, and I was sort of watching all of that and trying to emulate it, and you know, starting to find my own way of being funny. But also the other thing that happens is that someone once said that the comedian's worst fear is being laughed at. And so I was quite effeminate when I was a kid. I wasn't one of these macho boys. And so people used to tease me because of that. And the thing is, I sort of embraced that and turned that into humor.
Yeah.
So now you're in control of it. You know what I mean? It's a weird one. People are laughing at you, and then you go, oh no, I'm in on the joke.
Yeah.
And you kind of create your comic persona as a kind of reaction to that.
That's so amazing, because so many children, David, get bullied, or they get
every child some point or other experiences
but
something like that. And then lots of kids do bully and they don't even realize they're doing it.
Yeah.
They're just sometimes cruel and mean, or they like the status of being older than the younger kid, or there's someone a bit vulnerable. And so you know, that. So it's something I've dealt with in my books, you know, because I do think you can deal with serious subjects. And so I have written books, you know, with bullies in them, people being bullied. But I also wrote a book where a bully gets redeemed, because we find out why someone is a bully.
Yeah.
And it's because they're bullied.
Give me your money, punk.
Oh my God, it was you!
Yeah.
And I think that's generally what happens, isn't
Yeah.
it? Unfortunately, I don't think it'll ever go away as much as you try and discourage it. But it happens in so many different ways, doesn't it? Physical bullying, you know, mental bullying, emotional. It's so many different ways.
But what I love is that how you flipped it on the head and said, I'm going to take this head on and convert that into an act and a character that I'm known for.
I mean, it's complicated, isn't it? Sometimes people are bullied and their, you know, pocket money is stolen from them. It's very different. But for me, it was about, you know, being laughed at and changing that to being laughed with.
Right. Tell me, from being an introverted child to being an aspiring actor to being a judge on Britain's Got Talent, does it feel like a full circle and overwhelming? Do you look back and like, was this what 11-year-old David would have thought of?
No, I don't. I mean, I knew that I wanted to be an actor or a comedian, and I really started writing because comedians in this era, in the 1980s, tended to start writing their own material, like the Monty Python group wrote their own material. It didn't always happen, but it started to happen. I thought, well, I'm going to have to write some things. I can't just do other people's sketches. You know, I'm not going to get anywhere with that. And so I started writing, really just so I had something to perform. And then I realized that I felt that the writing was the most creative part of it. And I really liked, you know, coming up with characters and jokes and things. I think that's where the writing for me grew out of. And And as for thinking back of what I would have thought, I mean, I don't know. I pinch myself every day, feeling so lucky that anyone knows who I am, anyone cares about anything I do, anyone wants to read my books, anyone wants to watch me on TV. I just think, great. And I don't take any of these things for granted because I know it's, someone else's dream, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'd love to have a book published. I'd love to have my own comedy show. All these things. I'd love to be in a movie, and so many things have come good for me. I have to keep reminding myself how lucky I am.
Right. And tell me, when you're writing books for children, which part of your memory pool do you dive in to say, oh, this part of my childhood is what I'm going to bring into this book?
Well, I think there's two things. One is you want to see the world through the eyes of a child when you're writing a children's book, because things are larger than life when you're a kid.
Yeah.
The scary dinner lady is terrifying, and you've created some secret life for her where she's a witch or something like that.
Yeah.
We had a teacher at school who had he wore these shoes, which was like, and they were sort of built up at the front, and we said that he had like robot toes or something, just completely stupid things. But as a kid, you love those kind of things, and you make up all those sort of, you make up lots of you're living in a bit of a different reality. And so I think you've got to think about that when you're an author, that kids might believe that someone has robot toes. So there's no reason you can't put it in a book. And the second thing is, I think back to my childhood. I think of things that happen, sometimes sort of big things, sometimes just small experiences. And that's often the starting point for a story. Like my granny, real granny, was the inspiration for Gangster Granny. Not because she was an international jewel thief, but one day she was telling me about her adventures in World War II. When you're a kid and you're with your granny and granddad, you sort of often think they've always been old.
Yeah.
And you see a picture of them in their house on their wedding day or something. You go, what? Or a picture of them as a kid. So anyway, I always thought my granny was a bit boring, and then I asked her about her life during World War II. And she told all these amazing stories about her adventures. I thought, 35 years later, when I was writing Gangster Granny, I was thinking, God, wasn't that amazing that time at Granny's when she told me about World War II? She had a kind of secret life that I knew nothing about. And then I was thinking, secret life of a granny, and I had to think of something bigger, I felt, than what she told me.
Do you need to be extremely observant, intuitive, and in the moment to pick up these moments and find a story or weave a story or remember that anecdote so you can go back and use that back in your stories as an author?
Well, I think people often just tell you something and you don't think necessarily it's going to be an idea for a story. You just remember something someone told you. Like a friend of mine told me that when he was a kid, they used to see this old lady on the side of the road when they were driving to school. Mm-hmm. And one day they decided to stop at the bus stop and give this old lady a lift. But when she got into the car, they realized that she smelled really bad, like she stunk out the whole car. And she got out of the car and all that, their eyes were watering and everything. And the next day, they were driving to school and she was waiting at the bus stop and looked all hopeful they were going to give her a lift, and they didn't stop. And I thought it was such a heartbreaking story. And so I wrote this book called Mr. Stink, which is about, loving the smelliest person in the world kind of thing. It was weird. The person was not saying this is an idea for a book.
Yeah.
They were just telling me a story. And then maybe like a decade later, it's still, for some reason, that story's resonated with me.
So are people scared of telling you things because then they will be like, okay, David's going to flip this over and convert it into a book.
Or a
be
comedy
careful,
sketch.
Be careful.
Well, I'm curious. And, the thing is that when you're well known, people meet you and they often want to ask you questions about, when you did this, or why did you do that, or what's this famous person like? But, if I meet people, I'm really interested to hear their stories.
Are we flipping tables? Do you want me to hand this over to you?
Well, I'm just saying, as a plumber comes to my house or something like that, I'll say, what's the funniest thing that's happened to you as a plumber? I get in a taxi and I want to talk to the taxi driver about his life. Has anyone done a runner from the taxi and not paid the fare? All these kind of things. And so I love soaking up other people's stories. It's not so much necessarily that I just think, oh, I'll just try and turn this into a book or something.
Of course.
But I just generally like hearing people's stories.
It's so strange that you say this, because every time I sit in a taxi, I ask the taxi driver his story and where's he come from, because most taxi drivers in Mumbai are not from Mumbai. And I ask them the story, and my kids will be like, why do you like to chat with everybody? Like, why do you need to chat with the person in the elevator? And why do you need to chat with the person, the cab guy? Like, wherever he's come from, how does it matter to you? And I don't know why it matters, but I enjoy the conversation with that person. I'm just curious to know what's his story.
That's interesting.
But do you feel that the next sort of generation, one does not enjoy the process of reading and therefore are losing a very powerful tool with storytelling and communication?
I think so. And, I was just going to pick up on something you said. And, now everyone's like this when they're in a taxi or something. And sometimes people get into an Uber or something. They're just doing that. The driver doesn't say anything and they're just, thanks, just get out. And that's a shame, because we're not engaging with each other.
Yeah.
And as for kids, I mean, as a parent, you're delighted when you see your kid engrossed in a book.
Yeah.
But it is worrying the amount of, screen. I mean, looking around here, there's 5 people in the room, and all but one of them is on their phone. I'm not having a go. I'm just saying it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
And you see, our eyes are always drawn to them. I mean, I'm the same, and we're not looking around enough. We're not listening enough. And kids, I do think with my son is I ration the screen time. He's probably still on it a little bit too much, but
How old is he?
he's 11. But when I see kids in restaurants and things and their parents are just giving them a thing, they're just doing that. I think, no, I want my son to be able to talk, to grown-ups and and have something to say and make conversation and those kind of things. So books are a kind of gateway to your imagination, aren't they? And they're enriching. And the thing is, sometimes I find myself, and I'm as guilty as anyone, just looking at Instagram and videos are popping up, and I'm thinking, what am I doing? What am I looking? I don't even know what I'm looking at. There's a cat falling out of a tree. There's someone falling over in the street. There's some hot girl walking along the beach. What am I looking at any of this stuff for?
Yeah.
What is it? It's not interesting. It's, there's obviously, there is interesting things online, but so much of it is just a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
And then attention spans have gone down so much. TikTok is like 15-second video.
Yeah.
And then, when is someone going to do like the 5-second TikTok or even the 1 second or something? So, and with a book, you have to have a proper attention span, don't you? But watching clips on TikTok, it's 15 seconds.
So what are you doing to adapt to this new generation?
Well, I just try and write the most entertaining stories that I can. So I want to write books. I try and write books that children will choose to read for themselves. Now, obviously in school, we're all reading this book this term. That's great, very valid. I like this book as a kid. You say to your kid, you may like it too. But there's nothing better, I think, than a child choosing a book for themselves, actually wanting to read it because it's funny, it's entertaining, it's silly, it's exciting, whatever it might be. And so that's what I'm really trying to do. I know I'm not writing literature. I'm under no illusions. But I'm hopefully writing, good entertainment for kids.
Right.
And if they're reading one of my books, and often they say, oh, it's the first book that my child read, they're going to become a reader. And they're going to enjoy many more books too. Lots of other authors, much greater than me. And I'm absolutely fine with that. But I feel that's my place. And although, I'm not trying to do myself down, I think the books are of a good quality and I certainly try my best. But I still feel that's valid because you do get some brilliant but quite intellectual children's books or very sort of beautifully, poetically written children's books. But they're not for the reluctant reader. They're going to put off the reluctant reader. It's like if you were taking your child to the theatre for the first time. You wouldn't necessarily take them to see a Shakespeare play.
Yeah.
you take them to see something, maybe a bit funny or silly. Because you take some people to see a Shakespeare play, they'll never want to go to theatre again. I like Shakespeare. Shakespeare's brilliant, but some people are not going to respond to it. It's kind of like, you edge towards things, isn't it? You don't have the spiciest dish first, do you? You have something nice and mild, and then you get spicier and spicier. So I'm somewhere on that spicy scale. I'm not the most spicy, I'm not the least spicy. I'm halfway.
And Debbie, you mentioned about, attention span and about the screen. How do you straddle this world where you're also chasing the numbers because you have a significant social following, and you also want people to read? So how are you navigating that straddle?
Well, that's a good one, actually, isn't it? I feel like, social media is an incredible marketing tool. Not wanting to be incredibly cynical, but it is. And it's also amazingly free advertising.
Yeah.
If you think about it, if you wanted to tell someone you had a book out 20, 30 years ago, you had to put billboards up, you had to get on television shows, do whatever you could. But now, I can announce it to a couple of million people on Instagram, whether they all care or reading it. I mean, probably not, but some are. So that's what I think about it. For me, that's what I use it for.
Right.
I use it as a sort of one-way street and a tool. And I post funny clips. I've posted a few funny clips of the events I've done here in India, because there's always a kid who says something, outrageous or hilarious. But I feel like, I don't know, hopefully I'm not encouraging people just to sit and watch videos of me all day. So I don't post them all the time, and I try and make sure it's something of interest.
Right.
But I know what you mean. It's a hard balance to get, isn't it?
Yes. Tell me, given that your childhood, where you draw stories from, and childhood of children today are so different, how do you ensure that you're still finding that connection? Because they may not relate to,
yes.
like just a simple thing like grandmom. Like everybody has a grandmom, but 60% of the people today are living in nuclear families, and they probably see their grandmother like once in 6 months. How do you still connect with that?
Well, I think the thing you want to do most of all is make your stories as universal as possible.
Yeah.
So I don't try and necessarily set them in the present day. I make it a sort of, as timeless as possible. I mean, when you read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, it could be the past, it could be the future. It's hard to place. It's written in the 60s. Kids now read it. There's a Wonka film that came out a year ago. It was absolutely huge. So it's not, I don't know, it doesn't alienate you in any way because of the time it was written. It's not like you're trying to understand the 1960s. It doesn't really reflect the 1960s, is it? It's in its own world. So I try and do that in the book so they don't date. The interesting thing is, when I started writing books, I wanted to have contemporary references because I thought, well, not all kids' books have that. And then I look back and think, I wish I hadn't done that. And we've taken some out because you mentioned some TV show that isn't on anymore, some food that you can't buy anymore. And because, people tend to say, when people say, people don't really say, would you like a bag of chocolate, do they? They say, would you like a bag of Maltesers or something? So I wanted to reflect that, but then I realized it sort of often aged it. And I also think things like mobile phones are bad for stories. It was more fun when James Bond hacked out on his wits, right? As soon as he has a mobile phone, it's very, by the way, I'm locked in a dungeon in Egypt. Could you please come and help me? It kills the story. Otherwise, he could just, he had to escape on his own wits. So I try not to have mobile phones. And also, you want to discover a treasure map, don't you? Hidden in a trunk, buried in the garden. You don't want to, let's Google it. There we go. There it is. Again, it's like the enemy of storytelling. So I think as much as I can, I try and set books in a sort of, I don't know, either the definite period when none of these things existed, like I've had one in Victorian times, I've had one in the 1920s, 1930s, and I did one like 100 years in the future. So for me, I think I find it easier either to just kind of try and make it as universal as possible, or just pick a time period where I have to, where I can ignore these modern things that, for me, are the enemies of storytelling.
Incredible. Tami, we often get this question on Kidsstoppress. How do I make my kids read more? And I think you spoke about the reluctant reader, which was very interesting. You were someone who took to books very naturally. What would you say to parents whose kids are not reading? How can they get their kids to read more?
I think there's a book out there for everybody, and some kids, they're not going to be interested in my books. Maybe they want to read a book about Cristiano Ronaldo or something, and there's books out there for boys. And as much as I liked reading books, storybooks when I was a kid, I used to like reading books about space travel, about dinosaurs, about volcanoes, all those kind of things. So I think when your kid is starting to read, don't worry too much about what they're reading. It might be a comic book, it might be a graphic novel in some way, it might be just a book of facts about sharks or something. Just as long as they're enjoying the act of reading, and then sort of slowly catch the monkey. That phrase, it's like, just, let's move on, let's try this, let's move on to this, and so they can find their own way. I think boys are often the most reluctant readers. And my son, to some extent, he wanted to read books about sharks and look at lots of pictures of sharks and learn lots of facts and learn to name all the different sharks. And I felt, that's great. He wants to read a book. Right now, he wants to read a book about sharks. Okay, That's what he likes. And then, you turn them into readers. So I think there's that. And also just you've got to, with some kids, you've got to say, right, screens are down. Well, can I just play the computer game? In an hour you can, when you've done some reading. And, they're giving them the book and they sort of have to get on with it. And that's, valid in its own way. So a bit of bribery. And the other thing I do with my son is I read a page, he reads a page. I read a chapter, he reads a chapter. So it's something that we can do together. It starts off me just reading to him, and then we started to introduce that. And it worked quite well. And it was quite, it was nice because it was something we shared. Yeah. So I think as a parent, try and make the time, if you possibly can, even if it's just 15 minutes a day, to read with your kid. And even if you think they're a bit old to be read to, do that thing, alternate so that, you can discuss what's going on in the story. Yeah. If there's words they don't understand or references they don't understand, work those things out together. So that's what I do with my son.
Okay. Tami, what would you tell parents of budding writers?
I think it probably starts with the telling of stories, telling each other stories. I try and do that. So my son every night used to ask me to invent a story for him. And he'd tell me the things he wanted in the story. And he'd say, I want Batman to be in the story. I want my cousin Frankie to be in the story. I want my dog Bert to be in the story. And so I'd have to try and think of a story on the spot.
And you understand that you are David Walliams and you can do it. It could be harder for...
Yes, okay. But all I say is, it's like, it's trying to talk about stories like, you watch a film. What do you think happened after the film finished? What do you think Batman faced, the Joker and Penguin? Who do you think, if Batman, had a fight with all three villains at one time, what would happen there? Or, just try and pick up on things. I mean, children do love the imaginary world. Like me and my son used to walk across the beach to these rocks, and I'd say like a monster lived in the rocks. But then you can start saying, why do you think the monster lives in the rocks? Do you think he comes out at night? Do you think these kind of things where you're starting to tease out bits of the imagination. And so you're starting to create stories together. And then with budding writers, I suppose it's obviously a kid has got to have some hunger for it.
Yeah.
But try and give them the space and time to do it. And don't worry too much if they're not immediately creating a masterpiece. And they can write a story. I mean, I write these stories called The World's Worst Children. And sometimes kids write their own ones based on their brother or sister. So sometimes something just sort of, what would you think? If you had to create, the world's worst teacher, or what would it be like? What if your teacher is secretly, some evil demon or something? You can just try and get them going. A blank piece of paper is very difficult But if you say, let's try and think of a story about the naughtiest dog in the world.
Yeah.
You go, oh, okay, what would this very
So
naughty
we
dog
just
do?
should give them a prompt.
I think
or spark their
prompts,
curiosity.
unless your child is the next J.K. Rowling, and
Yeah.
then you don't need to worry. But prompts help, just like they do in
Yeah.
school, and making it fun. And let's draw some pictures with the story. You know, who we're going to show it to, we're going to read it to, and kids often, when I'm doing signings and stuff, go, I've written a book, and they've stapled some pages together, and here it is. And sometimes it might refer to something that I've done or someone else has done. Sometimes it's totally original, but they're starting on that journey, which is great.
Amazing. Okay, we're going to do some fun questions, but you've got to answer
Quickly.
Okay,
All right.
let's do that. One thing you want to change, improve about children's literary scenario,
Scenario meaning?
like what's happening around.
I'd like there to be more diversity in children's books. I mean, the thing is, there are some brilliant brands out there, you know, in terms of things like Wimpy Kid, Dogman, Captain Underpants, but I feel like not enough new authors are breaking through. So I'd like to see more diversity in the kind of books that kids get their hands on.
Do you feel like you've cracked the formula on creating bestsellers?
Yes.
I was waiting for
No,
this
not
one.
entirely, but
that actually answers why nobody's being able to crack the code.
Well, I've got a sense of it, but I'm trying to write a different story each time. So, you know, I'm still always trying, but I have a sense of it, yes. I mean, they're not
Do you
all
know
going to
when
be,
you
some are going to
start-
be better than others.
But do you know when you started writing, this one's going to do well? I'm very
No,
confident.
I think, oh, this will be a good story. I mean, I hope people are going to like it.
Can you predict numbers now?
No, I don't think about that. I mean, I'm obviously interested because I want my books to do well. But at the end of the day, it's, you know, a career like this is not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Yeah.
So if you write a good book and 10 years later people are still buying it, talking about it, then
Yeah,
you've done really
look
well.
at James Clear, Atomic Habits, only one book.
Yes, I know. I should have done something like To Kill a Mockingbird, and then I don't have to do one. J.D. Salinger was like 4 or 5 books, wasn't it? So there you go.
Yeah.
But I think it's what you really want is to create a good story. I mean, why people in India are picking up my book in a bookshop, you know, that's beyond me. I'm glad they are. But I can't contrive that. All I can do is think, hopefully this is a good story someone wants to read.
Okay. How much time do you spend on social media every day?
Probably about half an hour to an hour. Not too bad. But remember, I'm sort of posting things and, you know, that's what I'm mainly doing. Like when I go around doing these events and things, we film bits and pieces and take photos and stuff. And it's a fun way of kind of people engaging with what you're doing around the world. And we had a really funny thing yesterday where I asked the kids, I said, has anyone got a brother or sister who should be in the world's worst children for? And this kid went, this little girl who was like that tall and about 10, she went, yes, my sister, she's all nicey when my parents are around, but when they're not, she's a two-faced. It was hilarious. The whole audience were laughing at the Royal Opera House from Mumbai, and I thought, okay, that was a great clip because you can see it's just so spontaneous. And kids say the funniest things as a phrase, but they really do. I was really not expecting to hear the phrase two-faced at a children's book event.
Okay. Ebook or audiobooks? Which one do you prefer?
I never read an ebook, and I suppose so audiobooks.
Wow. I think that's because he doesn't live in an apartment in Mumbai.
Why? Because it's too noisy.
We're spaced out.
Yes, there's a lot of people who live here, aren't there?
The best feedback or the most cherished feedback you've ever received?
Dear David Walliams, I'm writing to you because you're my second favourite author. I really wanted to write to J.K. Rowling, but my teacher said not to, as she obviously receives too many. The brilliant innocence and honesty of children. There's someone will just write that.
This is amazing.
I need you to know you're my second favourite. Yeah, I think the biggest thrill for me is when someone comes up and says, I couldn't get my kid to read a book until he read one of yours, and now he's reading lots. That's the best thing you can hear.
That's amazing.
That's pretty great.
What's the first thing do you do when you wake up?
Awful to say, but I look at my phone probably to see what time it is, to see if someone's messaged me. But
Okay.
it depends. If I'm sleeping next to my dog, it's give my dog a stroke.
Okay. If you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Chocolate, probably. I love
Okay.
chocolate.
Your favorite literary character of all time?
I say the Twits from Roald Dahl's The
Ah,
Twits.
I love them. It's my
yeah,
most
I mean, they're a
favorite
couple,
book.
but I think they're brilliant, hilarious, hideous, awful, brilliantly entertaining characters.
Agree with you on that. What's a word you overuse while writing?
Overuse. Probably things like very and really, and you just don't need them.
Okay. If you weren't an author, what would you be doing?
I'd be unemployed. Well, I mean, I have other things that I do, so...
You're not very inspiring to people who are about to start writing.
Well, I also sort of act and do comedy and things like that, but I wasn't a writer. I wouldn't mind being a teacher, because you kind of get up in front of an audience, don't you, of kids. When I was a kid, I also wanted to be a vicar, but then I didn't believe in God, and I thought that might discount me. If I did, I'd probably be Pope by now.
Describe yourself in 3 words.
Really quite annoying. I don't know. What am I?
Come on, you're an author. You have to do a good job with the 3 words.
Yes. Oh, Jesus. Oh, dear. I'll say instead. 3 words. Dad. That's the first thing I am. Writer. That's the second thing I am. And actor. That's the third thing I am.
Okay. What's the most embarrassing moment of your career?
There's been so many. I worked with this actor who I'd seen on a science fiction program when I was a kid, and he was already like dressed up as the character, and I said, "Oh, you look fantastic. I love the medallion, I love the shirt, the flares and everything. So I love the toupee, it's brilliant, and I love the comedy teeth." And he went, they're my real teeth. I had to pretend I was joking, so it was. It was the first time I met him. It was the first minute, and we had to do this whole series together. And the first thing I did was insult him terribly.
Yeah, I can imagine. If you could swap lives with any character you've created, who would it be?
Oh, that's a good one. I know it's awful, but I quite like to be a villain. I'd quite like to be Bert in Ratburg. I played him in an adaptation, and I love doing it so much. Because he sort of talks like this, and that, I can smell a rat, and I just thought, it's really fun. I mean...
You like it because you can act it better.
That's probably it. I wouldn't mind being Billionaire Boy, because Billionaire Boy has got a water slide going from his room all the way into a swimming pool, and he wakes up every morning going down a water slide. And I love water parks and water slides that I do with my son, so I wouldn't mind being Billionaire Boy.
Have you ever had to explain your joke to someone?
Oh yeah, and when you explain a joke, it's death to that joke. They go, "What did you say?" Go, "Oh, well, because you said this, I said that." And they go, "That's not funny." So, well, it might have been if you'd been listening. But some people just don't really like humour or get humour, and you can't worry too much about that.
What's a hobby you've recently picked up?
I don't really have any hobbies because my work is my hobby really.
Okay.
But I didn't have dogs as a kid, and I now have dogs, and I love having dogs. So they're not really a hobby, are they?
Yeah.
But it's lovely to be with dogs.
Okay. What's your favorite thing about being a children's author?
Meeting kids who are excited to see you. I think that's the best thing
Even
ever.
if you're not Shah Rukh Khan.
No, I mean that's just great that you make people happy. And sometimes people say, what's it like being famous? Well, the nice thing is you just make people happy just by posing for a picture with someone, or saying hello to someone, or recording a video for someone, whatever it is. It's that, making people happy.
Right. What is tougher, comedy, writing, or being a dad?
Well, being a dad has come naturally to me. I think I'm quite funny, so comedy's kind of, I don't know, it feels like it's buzzing inside me a lot of the time. Not today, but other times. I think, being an author is, you say what's the most difficult?
Yeah.
I'd say probably being an author, because it's just so much to think about. You've got this story, you've got to pull these threads together, the characters are going to develop, there's going to be interesting themes, jokes along the way. You've got to end each chapter with a cliffhanger. So there's a lot to think about.
Okay. Now moving on to the recommendations. 3 books you loved reading as a child.
Well, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl, I think is probably the greatest children's book ever written. And I've not, everywhere I've been in the world, I mention that book and people go, oh yeah, all the kids have read it and know about it. They've heard of Golden Tickets, they've heard of Wonka Bars. They've seen there's 3 movies already of it. So they've heard of Oompa Loompas, they've heard a song from it. So to me, that is the greatest. I also, I loved The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe as a kid. Such a great idea. You go through a wardrobe into a magical world. And there's other amazing idea in it that you feel like you've been in that world for like days. But when you come out of it, it's only been like a few minutes. I think that's very true to how kids experience time and play. And the other book, I'd say, Dr. Seuss. For me, there's The Places You'll Go.
Yes.
Which is this beautiful book all about, what to expect in life that you can give to a child. A great gift if someone's just had a baby. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And I'd say that is pretty perfect. And the thing I love about Dr. Seuss is that he wrote the text and did the illustrations. And both are absolute perfection. That's a very rare skill. Because the other authors I've mentioned, myself included, I couldn't draw anything. But to do both those things, to be so iconic, so memorable, and there's not just one good book with him. There's
so
dozens.
Many of them.
So he is amazing, and I always mention him.
5 books with great illustrations that you would recommend.
Well, Alice in Wonderland has different illustrators, but the second illustrator, Arthur Rackham, did incredible illustrations. You've got E.H. Shepard, who did the illustrations for Winnie the Pooh, which are incredible. Quentin Blake, whose amazing illustrations for the Twits, I think, are the funniest illustrations of all time. I'll say The Grinch Who Stole Christmas is incredibly illustrated, obviously. And my last one would be a book that I don't know if people know here, but it's called The Tiger Who Came to Tea.
I love it.
Okay.
Judith Kerr. Again, she did the illustrations and the text, and it's the most beautiful book you can ever see. But also, I didn't mention Eric Carle and The Hungry Caterpillar, which is just a magical book, isn't it, with the holes in it and everything. Yes.
It's a book that every child really should experience early in life.
Books that shaped you.
Books that shaped me. Well, all the books I read made me want to be a writer in some way. I don't know if this is known here, but the Growing Pains of Adrian Mole or The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole.
No.
It's one of The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole by Sue Townsend is a brilliantly entertaining book about a boy just coming into his teenage years. Really made me laugh. I thought it was hilarious. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams is one of the most imaginative books I've ever read. And so that got me thinking that, you can write, if you use your imagination, you can write a book about anything at all. And it was really, really funny. And I'd say book that shaped me, I suppose maybe something emotional. Danny, Champion of the World by Roald Dahl.
Okay.
Because it's a really beautiful book about fathers and sons, about love, about loss, about the lovely friendship you can have with a child and everything. So I think that has really influenced me, also being a dad. And it's a book that Alfred, my son, really loved.
Okay. 3 common mistakes parents make when raising readers.
I think not devoting enough time to reading with their child. I think that's the first thing. Being too prescriptive about what book the child should read rather than letting them choose, because you might think, oh no, don't take that, but actually if they're interested in that and they actually want to read that, that's great. And not giving them your mobile phone to just play games on for hours and hours, but actually setting aside some time for them to read on their own when they're older.
Interesting. And of course, the last question, which is your favorite Indian authors for children.
Okay, well...
Don't tell me you haven't seen any.
Salman Rushdie is sort of my
I said for children.
I know you did.
For
but
children.
I'm trying to think.
I just don't want children to read Salman Rushdie, please.
There are. You're going to have to help me with this because actually I don't know many.
I must tell Nisha, if she's opening the door, that she hasn't done a good job of taking you around bookstores to actually introduce you to Indian authors. I think you're doing some incredible work.
Yes, I know. I'm terribly sorry, but I haven't done my research yet on that one. I'm trying to think because there's obviously a lot of sort of British Indian writers. But the Indian writers that I know are mainly for grown-ups, like Vikram Seth and Salman Rushdie. And so I need to experience more children's literature by Indian writers. There are some great ones in the UK, but I'm sadly ignorant at the moment, and that's a terrible failing. And by the time I leave India, I'll have read lots of books by
and
brilliant
that's
Indian
one
authors.
question that's going to hound him and make sure he doesn't forget me at all.
Never. I will never forget you.
No, I'm really glad, but I must say that you must see a few Indian authors. I think.
Yes,
they're
well,
doing
who
some
do you think? Who do you recommend?
So for the really little ones, I think there's Ashok Rajgopalan, who's written this amazing book about an elephant called Gajapati Kulapati. It's about a temple elephant and the funny sounds that. Sudhamurthy is another one. Ruskin Bond, I'm sure you've heard of Ruskin Bond as well.
I haven't actually, sorry, I'm not going to lie.
He is a British writer settled in Missouri. He's 87, if I'm not wrong. And there are just so many more. There are just so many incredibly good
I'm sorry,
authors.
I apologize.
But it'll be worth your while to explore. So you just get a feel of what India is all about. So thank you.
Well,
thank
lovely.
you for this interview.
Thank you, guys.
For parenting tips, celebrity interviews, recipes, conversations with experts, DIYs, and lots more. Subscribe to Kidsstoppress now.